The storm raged around Ben with a fury that seemed to mock his attempts to find safety. As the rain pelted down in unrelenting sheets, his mind raced. He knew he had to find shelter quickly. His body was beginning to tire, his clothes were soaked through, and the gnawing hunger that had started to creep in earlier was intensifying. The forest around him had transformed into a dark, ominous maze. What had once been familiar paths had become indistinguishable from the rest of the wilderness, swallowed up by the torrential downpour and thickening fog. The overhanging trees offered some respite from the rain, but it was only temporary. Ben had no idea how long he had been walking, but his legs were aching. And his senses were dulled by exhaustion. The path he thought he had been following had long since disappeared under the mud and puddles that spread across the forest floor. He paused, trying to regain his bearings. The wind howled through the trees, shaking their limbs and sending leaves swirling in all directions. He couldn't even hear himself think over the deafening roar of the storm. Desperation began to set in as the darkness deepened. Ben needed shelter, and he needed it fast. His fingers were numb from the cold, his jacket clung to him, wet and heavy. He could feel the chill creeping into his bones. Then, through the blur of rain, he noticed a narrow gap between two towering rocks, partially obscured by a dense cluster of pine trees. It wasn't much, but it was a break from the downpour, a small cave-like structure that might offer some protection. Without hesitation, he stumbled toward it, each step treacherous on the slick, uneven ground. His heart pounded as he moved, fueled by a combination of fear and the primal need for shelter. The small gap led into a shallow overhang, just deep enough to keep the rain at bay, though the wind still howled through the trees, sending waves of cold air into his fragile refuge. Ben dropped to his knees inside the makeshift shelter, gasping for breath. For a moment, he allowed himself to rest, though every fiber of his being screamed for him to keep moving. The storm, relentless as ever, battered the landscape outside, but he was, for now, safe. His fingers fumbled with the strap of his backpack. And he pulled it off, grateful for the moment of stillness. But the relief was short-lived. As Ben sat huddled in the darkness, something else began to weigh heavily on him: hunger. He hadn't eaten in hours, maybe longer. His stomach churned, reminding him of its emptiness. He had a few energy bars left in his pack, but the rain had soaked everything else. His food was the only thing that hadn't been ruined by the storm, but it was nowhere near enough to sustain him for long. He tore open a bar and took a bite, the dry, tasteless texture offering little comfort as his body screamed for more. Ben glanced around the shelter. The overhang was bare, save for a few jagged rocks and the wet soil beneath him. There was no firewood, no dry materials to start a fire, and his matches had already been drenched in the downpour. He was stuck, in every sense of the word. The wilderness, which had once seemed like an adventure, now felt like a relentless, uncaring force, testing him in ways he hadn't prepared for. He had taken his comfort for granted, the warm meals, the shelter of his home, the ease of life that came with modern conveniences. Now, he was completely at the mercy of the wild. The wind began to pick up again, rattling the trees above and pushing the rain into his shelter. Ben hugged his knees to his chest, trying to conserve warmth. He could feel his body growing colder by the minute, the wet clothes clinging to his skin like ice. His thoughts turned to home, his wife, his friends, his life in the city. The feeling of isolation settled in. He wasn't sure how far he was from civilization anymore. His mind raced as he thought about what he should have done differently. He should have checked the weather more thoroughly. He should have prepared for the storm. But hindsight, as they say, was always clearer than the present moment. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Every minute felt like an eternity. The storm continued its assault on the forest, and Ben, exhausted and hungry, curled tighter into himself for warmth. His thoughts grew disjointed as sleep began to overtake him, but he kept fighting it. The last thing he wanted was to drift off and be caught unawares in the wild. He needed to stay alert. Suddenly, he heard something. A rustling in the bushes outside his shelter. At first, it was faint, but it grew louder, closer. Ben's pulse quickened. His mind raced, trying to identify the source of the sound. It wasn't the wind, this was something larger, something moving. A large animal, perhaps. His instincts kicked in, and he instinctively reached for the only thing he had, a long stick he had grabbed from the forest earlier to help steady himself on the trail. He held it tightly in his trembling hands, ready to defend himself. The rustling grew louder, and then, as if to answer his fears, a deep growl echoed from the darkness. Ben froze. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the sound, low and menacing. It was the unmistakable growl of a predator. His heart pounded in his chest as he strained to listen. What kind of predator would be out here in the middle of a storm? A bear? A mountain lion? He didn't know. But he knew that he was completely exposed. His shelter, small and flimsy, offered no real protection against a predator. He was alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of whatever was lurking outside. The growl came again, closer this time. Ben could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath heavy paws. He slowly, carefully, stood up from his crouched position, holding the stick in front of him like a weapon. His breathing was shallow, his muscles tight with fear. The growling seemed to be circling him, and Ben's mind raced. Should he leave the shelter and try to find a safer place? Should he stay and hope the animal would pass by? Before he could make a decision, there was a flash of movement, a shadow darting through the rain. Ben's heart skipped a beat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he stood frozen, not daring to move. Then, from the darkness, two yellow eyes glowed in the night, piercing through the storm. A mountain lion. Ben's blood ran cold. He knew that mountain lions were stealthy predators, often attacking from behind, and they could cover great distances with surprising speed. His mind flashed through every survival guide he had ever read. Make yourself appear larger, don't run. Back away slowly. But in his current state, cold, tired, and weak, he wasn't sure how long he could stay composed. For a long moment, the lion stood there, watching him, its glowing eyes never leaving Ben's face. Time seemed to slow as they locked eyes, the predator sizing up its prey. Ben's heart raced. He could hear the thunder rumbling in the distance, and the rain hammered the ground like an army marching through the forest. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the lion turned and melted back into the shadows, vanishing without a trace. Ben stood frozen, his pulse thundering in his ears, his body shaking with fear. He didn't dare make a sound, not even a breath, until he was sure the animal was gone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to relax, just a little. The mountain lion was gone, but the danger wasn't over. He was still stranded, still lost in the wilderness, and the night was far from over. Ben sank back into the corner of the shelter, his heart still racing. The encounter had shaken him to his core. He had narrowly escaped death, but the wild had made it clear that it was not done with him yet. The rest of the night passed slowly. The storm kept raging outside, but inside his little shelter, Ben remained wide awake, his mind filled with thoughts of survival, the weight of his isolation pressing down on him. Every sound in the darkness felt like a threat. Every rustle in the trees, every shift in the wind, reminded him that he was not alone in this wilderness. He had made it through the first night. But he knew that the days ahead would test him in ways he could not yet understand.